One thing I want to mention too, I want to make sure that I give a shout out to the Legacy Foundation Committee at Pease CRC. We had a chance to do a Skype call a month or so ago with everyone on that committee. And Michael, of course, you're sort of representing their vision, their work here, and their story. But I would be remiss if I didn't make sure that they were acknowledged in this story as well.
That's correct. I am here representing a larger group of people who represents our foundation committee, or our foundation team, and they're the ones that largely drive the ship here. Right. Related to that. They allowed me to speak on their behalf, which they'll maybe thank me or not for that later. But no, I represent a larger group of people who has been very much behind this project even before I got involved with it.
Oh, that's cool. One of the interesting things about this story is that the Pease Christian Reformed Church had a memorial fund for a long time. And I'm curious about that fund, how it functioned for your church, because I want to try to contrast it with a legacy foundation later.
The Memorial Fund was set up years ago. It's probably been in place for 3 decades or better as a when somebody in the congregation would pass away, there would sometimes be charitable gifts that a family would make in memory of their loved one, or someone would make in memory of their loved one, and those would go into that memorial fund. And over time, that fund would get used to purchase things for the church, various, if the church needed. Some artwork maybe might be a part of that, or a particular project, something like that. The church might use those funds to buy something, furniture, that kind of thing, sure. for the church. So generally, these were smaller gifts. Rarely did at any given time did we receive anything above, certainly 4 figures related to that. So it was a fund that over time had been built up and spent down, and built up and spent down, and so on. And to date, we've got about, before we started the Legacy Foundation, we had somewhere around between $30,000 and $35,000 in that fund.
Okay. So, again, getting our minds around a Legacy Foundation and how they function and what's their value, can you contrast then for me the difference, for leaders at your church, what's the difference in their thinking as they think about a memorial fund versus a legacy foundation?
Sure. A memorial fund would be some of those smaller gifts and donations would go, although a legacy fund can certainly take those as
sure.
well.
Sure.
But a legacy foundation, or a foundation in general, is more thinking very, very long term. In the growth of the church, we think of it in terms of leaving a legacy. Hence the name. Right. Those who came before us in a congregation, and most congregations, left a legacy of a church building that they built, and so on. So we don't need those kinds of things anymore as a congregation, but we do want to be able to sustain those things into the long term, and that's where a legacy foundation can come in and be helpful with that. Okay. Another place where it becomes helpful is to think about larger donations or larger gifts. People thinking about estate planning and that kind of thing. Okay. What would we do if a congregation member had a relatively large estate, or somebody had a relatively large estate, and they wanted to leave that to the congregation, or a portion of it to their church, which we would hope people would consider doing. Right. Most people aren't going to set up their foundations in such a way, or set up their estates in such a way to say, hey, I'm going to give this large chunk of money, maybe 5 or maybe even 6 figures, but that's just going to go right into the general fund somehow. Right. That doesn't work, and so that was the other impetus behind it. How can we encourage estate planning and estate giving, and including the church as a part of that for people? Yeah, that is really good, and maybe we're jumping ahead here, and that's okay. But I think that's a key point, is that the difference a legacy foundation makes is that
there's an awareness. Church leaders can make their church membership aware that the church is ready and able and set up to receive those kinds of gifts. The larger sort of estate gifts, that they're able to receive them and that they'll be stewarded well. And
correct.
That confidence isn't always there, and that's a really big point.
No, you hear stories about this where a church who isn't set up to handle these kind of larger gifts don't know they're going to receive them, and all of a sudden come into a what for them would be a significant amount of money,
right.
And it ends up wreaking havoc on the life and the ministry of the church. People fight over it, things get divided. We wanted to be on the front end, be proactive as opposed to reactive in that regard,
yeah.
And also thinking just quite plainly that we might be missing out on an opportunity. Somebody looking at planning their estate. Where do I want my estate to go? What do I want my legacy to be? Realizing that the church doesn't have anything set up to handle something like that, and say, so I'm going to give my money elsewhere.
Right.
There's an opportunity cost that could get lost there as well.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the interesting parts of the story of a legacy foundation at Pease Christian Reformed Church is, as your committee was sharing with me, is that there was talk of a foundation for a number of years, and I'm curious about what changed. Sort of, what's the story of this foundation being established, and what's the difference? Why now is really the question.
Yeah, you're right. It had been talked about off and on for a number of years, well before my time in Pease. I've been in Pease 5 years now, and that conversation was going on well before my time. And kind of the prevailing knowledge among the leadership was when that was brought up is, hey, when the money is needed, the Lord will provide. The church isn't in the business of saving money or hoarding money, as sometimes it might be
right.
thought. The church isn't a bank, and that's true.
Right.
The Lord does provide and has provided. We're going to be 125 years old in 2020, our congregation, and the Lord has provided for us well in those 125 years without a foundation. And so that point is absolutely valid and true. But I think the turning point comes when you get the right mix of people in leadership who recognize, again, that the way we think about our finances has really changed. The way retirement planning works now, the way planning for the future financially has changed a lot. And so we ended up really, quite honestly, with a right mix of people in the right places at the right time to bring this up and say, hey, no, we're going to do this, and we need to do this, because otherwise we're missing out on an opportunity to help people be good stewards of what the Lord has blessed them with. Right.
Yeah, I think one of the comments that was made when I met with your Legacy Foundation committee was sort of like, what's the next 125 years? What's God got in store for us as a church for the next for the next stage or the next chapter of ministry?
Right, and that's the benefit of the way the Barnabas Foundation has set things up with their Legacy Foundation, is that you have these different funds that we can funnel money into. So we set up, I think you have 5 different options. I think we set up 3 of those to be able to move forward in and say, hey, we've got these 3 different categories of funding opportunities within the foundation itself, directed toward missions, directed toward a building, directed toward Christian education.
Right.
There's a number of different options there.
Yeah, churches can also choose like benevolence as a category, things like that. So it makes a lot of sense for a church to be able to communicate that to their members, because they can see that there's a structure in place, there's a plan in place for their gifts to be stewarded. So it makes a lot of sense.
That's exactly right. You can present that option to them. Where is your heart? Where would you like to see your donation go, and how would you like it to be used? We can help direct that within reason, right? I mean, you can't have it go toward be too specific, but certainly there's some things that, hey, my passion or my family's passion was toward this. We'd like to direct our funds that way, and we can certainly do that now.
Yeah, I liked what you said earlier too, in terms of there's opportunities that perhaps get missed along the way, and with a Legacy Foundation now, the Pease Christian Reformed Church has ability to sort of promote those opportunities within the congregation. And I think that's that's some of the work of a legacy foundation for a church, is that once it's there, that foundation itself has to be stewarded as well.
That's correct. We don't want to set up classic examples of these things that get a lot of buzz at the beginning. Hey, we've got this set up, and then crickets about it for the next 5 or 10 years.
Right.
Part of the challenge and part of the challenge of our team that we've got around us is to keep this in front of people on a regular basis of working with people, even to the point of going to them and saying, hey, if you're making some estate planning, if you're entering into your retirement years, this is available for you if you'd like to take advantage of it. Again, not pressure, not anything like that, but just keeping it in front of people.
Yeah. I like, again, the word you use was opportunity, and you don't want to miss opportunities, not just for church and church ministry, but for individuals to make an impact kingdom-wise through their estates and through their planned giving.
Right. So the Memorial Fund remains in place even as we have a Legacy Foundation, and that gets used for some of those smaller types of opportunities that come available. The church needs this or the church needs that, and the Memorial Fund can be able to provide that. We're thinking again with this Legacy Foundation more long term. Bigger capital improvement projects, supporting a ministry or a mission somewhere overseas or locally, a number of opportunities that as it grows, we can use it that way.
Yeah. So that's one of the critical things I think related to a Legacy Foundation is that my thinking is that a Legacy Foundation doesn't really happen unless church leaders, have a vision in mind for something more, something beyond today, something beyond sort of the here and the now. And I really do think that church leaders who are considering or would think about a Legacy Foundation have to think in those terms related to church ministry beyond just me right now in this ministry or just us right now in this ministry, that it has to push out further than that. Right.
It's definitely a vision casting thing. This goes way beyond, hey, what's next year's budget going to look like? Right. This is looking what are we going to be able to do 25 years from now?
Right.
Because that's how foundations work, is they get built over time. Although this happens occasionally, there's very rarely that somebody is going to say, "Hey, I've got $1 million sitting around, and I'm going to start this foundation."
Right.
We've started out with $20,000 in there that we actually moved from our Memorial Fund into this, and we divided it over 3 funds. We aren't going to be able to do a lot with $10,000 right now. But in 20 years, we've got a whole different thing if we continue to keep it in front of people.
Right. Yeah. And that's it. Yeah. Right. That's the challenge. And it's also, it's not a quick fix kind of a thing either.
No.
It's not, it's a long-term strategy for funding long-term ministry, for many years to come. So,
and it's a sustaining thing as well.
Right.
If we say, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to make this one effort for this ministry or this mission that we're a part of, and we're going to really go after it, and you raise a bunch of money one year to do something, that's great. Well, now you've got to raise it the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that to keep it going, and that's the hard part.
Right.
A Legacy Foundation helps do that. It takes a lot longer to do that, but it can do that over time and say, hey, now this is going to be sustainable, maybe even into perpetuity, but it's going to take us 20 or 25 years to get there.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Let's just a couple more questions. One. So a church can set up its own foundation, and so I'm just curious in terms of your own perspective, and not just yours, but that of the committee. Why not just do something like this yourselves, as far as establishing a foundation versus Legacy Foundation through Barnabas?
Sure. That's a great question. I'm part of a foundation. I'm on a board of another foundation that does exactly that. It's managed locally, so to speak. With this foundation, we decided to work through Barnabas for a couple of reasons. One is it takes some expertise in knowing financial markets and knowing investing and so on. And most congregations don't have that. We're blessed to have a couple of a banker and an accountant, CPA, as part of our finance team or our Legacy Foundation team, including myself. I happen to have experience as a banker. I was a banker in a former life, and so have a little bit of experience from that angle as well. But most churches don't have that. Working with Barnabas provides us the opportunity to rely on your folks, your expertise to do that. Plus, we get the advantage of having your buying power. $300 and something million under assets under management that you guys have right now that we get to tap into. Our 20,000 right now, hopefully it grows over time, is a really small piece of that, but we get the advantage of being a part of that.
Right.
The other thing that it offers is liability protection. We are set up now. Those assets come off our books and are a part of yours, and that protects the church financially in case of any sort of a lawsuit or some liability down the road. That those become kind of untouchable. Maybe is a good way to think about that.
Right. Yeah. So when a foundation or Legacy Foundation through Barnabas is established, then a lot of the sort of carrying the heavy water or it gets done by Barnabas Foundation. It's not that it's sort of off the radar for the good folks at Pease Christian Reformed Church. It's still very much on the radar in terms of stewarding it and promoting it and letting people know the opportunities. But sort of the mechanics of it end up being through Barnabas Foundation.
That's correct. We continue to get monthly statements from you, from the Legacy Foundation there, so keep track of it that way. And we're very much involved in that piece. But the actual investment and the management of the investment happens with Barnabas. And part of the reason that can work is because we as a church, and I think a lot of churches, Barnabas is a trusted organization, and that helps to have that relationship there is important. That Barnabas is a Christian organization that we have some experience with, and many churches do, and we trust you to steward that stuff wisely and well, not invested in appropriately, all of those things, ethical investing practices, so on and so forth.
Yes. Something I should mention too is just in terms of support for promotion. Barnabas Foundation does produce a quarterly newsletter called Generosity Today. That's sent as an e-newsletter, but it also comes as a PDF attachment that in the church office they can just print off and make copies and put in church mailboxes. And essentially it's highlighting a foundation, a Legacy Foundation, and also generosity and the calling and challenge of generosity. So I want to make sure I mentioned that. So last question, Michael. What are some important considerations for church leaders that might be thinking about a Legacy Foundation? What should they take into account?
I think a couple of things. First is you need to have the right mix of people. Part of the reason this worked for us now is because we had the right mix of people in leadership to have that conversation. A pastor can lead this conversation, but he or she can't be the only one who's the driving force behind it. You need to have a group of people who recognizes the value, the importance, has the vision for the future for this around you to do this. If it's just the pastor who's saying, hey, we need to quick set this up, it's not going to work and it's going to fall flat on its face. And the reason it's going to fall flat on its face is for another reason. Another important consideration is you have to keep this going. This is a long-term investment strategy. Again, as we talked about, you need to have a group of people who is behind this, who gets the long-term vision for it, and is able to keep it going forward long after a pastor has moved on to another congregation, or has retired, or whatever. This is way beyond one person, and it's work. This is for the long-term health, viability, and future ministry opportunities of that specific congregation.
Yes, that's a really great point. Just in terms of it takes a community of leaders to have the vision to make it happen and to steward it into the future. So it's a great point.
That's exactly right. So I even now we're set up in such a way that as a pastor, I for the most part take a back seat. I serve in an advisory capacity only on that foundation team. I'm not a voting member or anything like that. This is a project that once it got going, I want to step away from and let the congregation own it now.
Yeah. Oh, that setup says a lot about your leaders and a lot about your leadership as pastor too.
Absolutely, it does.
Pastor Tenhaken, I want to thank you so much for taking this time. This has been an enjoyable conversation. I think you've really helped shed a lot of light on a Legacy Foundation and how it functions in the life of a church. I again want to thank the members of your Legacy Foundation committee for their commitment, for their vision, for their leadership, for allowing you to speak on their behalf. I think you've done an excellent job, and they should give you a pat on the back when you get back.
I'll give them one.
You'll give them one, and my greetings as well, and the Lord's blessing.